Even though we're not together each week, we're able to be in contact with each other. And as we are keeping contact with each other, we keep hearing about what's going on in our church families' lives. When you hear about people struggling and hurting and frustrated, remember that's not just like the news. That's not just someone out there. That's the people that you and I know, people right around us here. Some of you online watching right now know full well that's you. Life isn't being what we would consider fair to a lot of people right now, is it? I want to continue this series through the first half of the book of Daniel this week, a series that I've entitled While You Were in Exile. And it is an ongoing look at someone who was in exile. He was kept from his family members. He was faced with adapting to a life that he hadn't foreseen for himself. I see a lot of encouragement for you and me in Daniel, and today I'd like you to turn to chapter 2 of the book of Daniel, and we're going to look for it there. If all that we knew about Nebuchadnezzar II was what we read right here in Daniel, I think it'd be tough to picture such a hot-headed, arrogant tyrant being in power for 43 years over a kingdom like Babylon. But the more that I step into and look at history of this time, even look at the art and the architecture of Babylon, it really does fit right together with everything that we read about in the book of Daniel. This guy was a character. Like other kings around that era, he was all about making a name for himself by leaving his name all over the place. Anybody who got in the way of Nebuchadnezzar's pursuit of that probably got removed. I want to put up a picture of an engraving. Here it is, the only Polaroid that exists of Nebuchadnezzar II. It is the only supposed portrait of this king. It's a copy of a cameo found in Asia. And you can read along the inscription in cuneiform there that says, "To Marduk, his lord, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, for his life this made." Remember, King Nebuchadnezzar had raided Jerusalem. He took captive some of the nobility and the more promising young men and brought them back to his kingdom to be re-educated and then prepped to serve as men in his royal court. And among them were these 4 young men, including Daniel, whose stories are told in these first 6 chapters of Daniel. Their interactions with Nebuchadnezzar make up the accounts of these 6 chapters, and the main message of the whole book can really be found in chapter 4. In fact, if you'll go with me there to chapter 4, verse 17, let's look at that together. Daniel 4:17. "The sentence is by the decree of the watchers, the decision by the word of the holy ones, to the end that the living may know that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will, and sets over it the lowliest of men." That same statement that we just read there at the end is repeated 2 more times, 3 times in chapter 4. The Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whom he will. That's really the message of the whole book of Daniel in a sentence. And this story in chapter 2 starts to drive that home in some big ways that I'd like us to consider right now. Now, we're going to see that God set up this whole scene, how he gave an interpretation of it through Daniel, and then he even gave a prophecy of world history from 606 BC clear up to the time of Jesus. The story opens with the king having a dream. Now that may not seem like a big deal to you or to me, but to Nebuchadnezzar it was. It woke him up. It was the kind of dream that bothers you and keeps you up. Only in this case, he may have forgotten the dream. He calls on the magicians, the enchanters, the sorcerers, and the Chaldeans to help him sort this all out. You see, when you're the king and you wake up in the middle of the night, you can do that. Doesn't matter what time of the day it is. If you can't sleep, ain't no one's going to sleep. Chapter 2 Verse 3, the king said to them, I had a dream, and my spirit is troubled to know the dream. Then the Chaldeans said to the king in Aramaic, O king, live forever. Tell your servants the dream, and we will show the interpretation. The king answered and said to the Chaldeans, The word from me is firm. If you do not make known to me the dream and its interpretation, you shall be torn limb from limb, and your houses shall be laid in ruins. But if you show the dream and its interpretation, you shall receive from me gifts and rewards and great honor. Therefore, show me the dream and its interpretation. And with that, King Nebuchadnezzar introduced the game, Would You Rather? More than once, I have been awakened by my wife telling me that she has had a dream in the middle of the night, that I was in it, and that in her dream I have done something awful, or I have failed to do something that I was supposed to do. And for a while, I have to convince her not to be mad at me for what I did or didn't do in her dream. Has anybody else had that happen to them? Doesn't sound fair, does it? Well, you talk about unfair. Nebuchadnezzar has had a dream. He calls in his wise men to tell him what it means. Now, from a wise man's point of view, that's not a big deal. In fact, you could just make it up. Who's going to know the difference? But in this case, the king says they have to tell the king what he dreamed. That's not possible. And so twice, chapter 2, they tell him the thing the king asks is difficult. Verse 11, and no one can show it to the king except the gods, whose dwelling is not with flesh. Because of this, the king was angry and very furious, and commanded that all the wise men of Babylon be destroyed. So the decree went out, and the wise men were about to be killed. They sought Daniel and his companions to kill them. Life had already been very unfair, if you will, to Daniel and his friends. They had lost their homes, their families, their familiar culture, even their names. Now they're going to die simply because the king had a dream and no one could tell him what he had dreamed. I think it would have been really easy for Daniel and his friends to look heavenward and to be embittered at God, maybe even to turn away from him at this point. Have you ever seen that happen to someone who's disenchanted in God? I have. Life can be that way. Doesn't even have to involve a hot-headed tyrant king. All you have to do, in fact, is draw air and take nourishment. Sooner or later, something unfair is going to come your direction. But there's more to it than that. I once told about my anatomy and physiology teacher in high school, Mr. Mickle. Mr. Mickle had a piece of driftwood hanging in the corner of his classroom. And I remember on the first day of class, he told us, over there is my piece of driftwood, and on it, it said, no one said life is going to be fair. He said, throughout the semester, if there's something that comes up and you want to come gripe at me about it, I'm going to point to that piece of wood and I'm going to say to you, get my drift. That wasn't overly helpful. Now, I'm not saying that what follows here in Daniel 2 is a surefire formula to deal with all of life's unfairness, but I do think what Daniel did is useful for us today. Look in chapter 2, verse 14. After all this happened, then Daniel replied with prudence and discretion to Arioch, the captain of the king's guard, who had gone out to kill the wise men of Babylon. You see, the first thing Daniel did was use his head. He went to the powers that be, and he asked for some clarification, and he asked for a chance to do something about it. And then, skip down to verse 17. Then Daniel went to his house, and made the matter known to Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, his companions, and told them to seek mercy from the God of heaven concerning this mystery, so that Daniel and his companions might not be destroyed with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. While life was being brutally unfair to Daniel and his friends, he took matters to God. He invited them in on it, and they took the matter to God. He did what he could to turn it around, and he took it to God. Those two things don't exclude each other. I remember a fellow minister who worked with my dad, who prayed on more than one occasion, wording that went something like this: Lord, help us to pray as if everything depends on you, and to work as if everything depends on us. I don't know that Daniel exactly said such a thing, but I see that he didn't do just one or the other. He took his problem to God, and he also did what he could to change it. Here's the deal. There is help for our lives when we need it. This simple chapter in Daniel's life is a reminder of that. Life isn't being fair to you right now. Okay, there's help for your life right now, too. It's there. Act like it's there. Take it to God, and also look for the help. The next part of this story is just way too long to fit into the time that I have this morning, so let me just jump right into this. That is the fact that there is a God who has all of life under control. Start reading about it in verse 24. After he took the problem to God, God gave Daniel the answer that he was seeking. He was given the dream, he was given the interpretation, and in one visit to the self-absorbed king, the whole threat was taken away. The entire story turns a corner here. It's in these verses that we learn that Nebuchadnezzar's dream was really a preview of the next 600 plus years of world history in Mesopotamia. He saw a statue, a man, made of different materials. And each material represented different empires that would rise and fall in the future. Looking at the rest of the book of Daniel, looking back on world history, putting that all together, we can name those empires. We can even tell the years of their rise and fall. Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome. The other chapters of Daniel contain more information about them, but the end of the vision features a final kingdom, one that will dominate them all, one that will never fall. Most of this dream was about the years after Nebuchadnezzar. But what this vision does for him and does for Daniel and does for us is remind us of this: God's involvement and God's power at work in human history. This is just a little bit of heaven's perspective on the kingdoms of man. God sees those and he knows all about them. Long before they rise, long before they fall, he can give a man like Daniel the ability to speak about it before it ever comes to pass. And when all is said and done, God brings it to the conclusion that he has in his plans. Sometimes the thing that we need to help us when life is flying at us with unfairness is a reminder that ultimately God has this whole mess under control. Nebuchadnezzar couldn't have begun to tell anyone that Babylon would fall to Cyrus the Great in 539 BC. There is nothing about the future, though, that's going to catch God off guard. Bear that in mind when you start to feel anxious about the way things are headed. You see, God already knows it inside and out. He's already given us a pretty detailed glimpse of the end of the story. At the end of the book, it's all coming around to his conclusion. Here's one more note from this part of the book of Daniel. That is that God cares about your life, and you can trust him with it. Starting in verse 46, this whole story now has changed over to the big sigh of relief that comes once a crisis has been averted. It's like stage 5, all right, when it appears in Daniel chapter 2. Look at verse 46. Then King Nebuchadnezzar fell upon his face and paid homage to Daniel and commanded that an offering and incense be offered up to him. The king answered and said to Daniel, "Truly, your God is God of gods and Lord of kings and a revealer of mysteries, for you have been able to reveal this mystery." Then the king gave Daniel high honors and many great gifts, and made him ruler over the whole province of Babylon, and chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. Daniel made a request of the king, and he appointed Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego over the affairs of the province of Babylon. But Daniel remained in the king's court. Here's the last lesson to learn from this story this morning, and that is you can trust God with your life. Some of you hear that and you're thinking, what? Someone I can't see? Someone who's unpredictable? I'm supposed to trust him with my life now and then with my forever also? Well, yes. Think about it. You already do this every day with lesser entities. You load yourself into a large metal tube. At that point, you give up your control. This device that you've stepped into is going to hurtle you forward inside of it to about 180 miles an hour, and at that point it's going to lift off of the ground and gradually ascend to somewhere around 40,000 feet in the air and travel at around 600 miles an hour. This may go on for hours before you finally stop and then disembark. You have no control over this. The whole process is controlled by the designs of engineers and placed then in the hands of one person that you don't know, called a pilot. You lie down on a bed and you allow somebody to poke a needle in the back of your hand, and after answering some questions and signing a few papers, somebody injects a drug into your system and you fall asleep. For a couple of hours, a team of people that you don't know very well invades your body while you lie completely unconscious. Then you wake up and you begin to hear about what happened while you were asleep. You're driving down State Street toward Belvedere. You're in a lane there on Highway 20, driving 55 miles per hour. Somebody driving at the same speed from the opposite direction is coming right at you. And at a crucial moment, the two of you pass each other just a few feet apart from a head-on collision. At least, that's what you're expecting to happen over and over and over again in just a few minutes' time. You're counting on those other drivers to stay in their lane, just like they're counting on you to stay in yours, and your lives depend on it. In many ways, on many fronts, we're all counting on one another right now to stem the spread of the coronavirus. They tell us that we can succeed at that if we will all work at that. They tell us that means washing our hands frequently and thoroughly, that it means wiping down surfaces, it means wearing a mask over your mouth and your nose, not shaking hands, keeping socially distanced. Anytime you go anywhere involving other people, you're depending on them to keep those guidelines, and they're depending on you. And for some, their life may depend on that. Here's the point. For every facet of life where we tend to struggle with trusting God with our lives, for every place in life where we hesitate and we ask ourselves, does God really have things under control or not? For any situation where that comes into our thinking, there are a dozen everyday places where we already do that without giving it a second thought. I'm asking you to join me this morning and give it a second thought by concluding that you can trust God with your life. You have a much better reason to trust Him than all of those other people that you trust every day, people that you don't even know. Life is going to be unfair. It is. And when it comes to our whole relationship with God, think about this. We ought to be glad that it's not fair. You see, God has chosen not to deal with us according to what's fair. It's called grace. Grace is about God unfairly taking the punishment that we deserve and placing it on His Son, Jesus, in our place. Grace is about declaring us clean when in fact we've worked kind of hard to dirty our record. God's grace isn't fair, not at all. It's beyond fair. And we should be thankful for that today. The cross is the greatest example of how God is present in the unfairness of life. Was it a mistake? It wasn't a random accident. It was the working of God, and it was the greatest example of undeserved favor in all of history. It stands today as an unmistakable reminder that when life's not fair, God is still there. My hope today is that if you're understanding that and really coming to this understanding for the first time in your life, that you'll pursue a relationship with Jesus Christ, that you'll pursue how this forgiveness can be yours, how you can get this as a part of your life and begin a relationship with the Lord. We're putting prompts up throughout the online time today, asking you to get in touch with us at Central. We're separated by space, but we're not separated to the point where we can't communicate with each other quite thoroughly. And so we want to open up a conversation with anybody who today is interested in beginning a relationship with Jesus Christ. Would you please get in touch with us? Those of you who are already followers of Jesus, I just want to encourage you today not to get overwhelmed or to feel overwhelmed by the idea that life seems unfair right now. It is. It has been. It will be. And I'm thankful today that life is not just fair when it comes to the grace that we've received from our God.